Hello and welcome to The Legal Loop, the show where we explore the journey of successful entrepreneurs and business leaders with a twist of legal insights and tips. On today's show, we have special guest Alex Price, who is joining us as he has recently sold his business, and he's going to be telling us about his experience in business and also getting to that point where he felt ready to sell. So Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. Happy to be talking. Looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us. So to start, can you give us a brief background about your business and your journey as an entrepreneur?
Absolutely, yeah. So I founded a business called 93 Digital. We were a web design and build agency, first and foremost. We later became also a digital marketing agency, and we had a specialism in working with B2B tech and software clients. So I founded the agency more or less kind of in my bedroom. I kind of started freelancing when I was still at school. That turned into a small agency. I dropped out of university and basically spent my 20s building the business from just me to, we were a team of about 35 when we were acquired. Had an opportunity to sell, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk a lot more about, but that was in April 2022, and then spent 18 months or so working for our acquirer until November of last year, and here we are. So that's the story in a nutshell, but I'm sure we'll touch on some key milestones as we discuss more.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex. And I think a key question is when did you think it was time to sell the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a very personal decision for anyone to sell a business, right? And this is something I know from doing, I work with a number of agencies now more on an advisory basis, and I kind of get asked the same question. And I think sometimes I feel like I'm kind of wriggling out of giving a solid answer by saying what I say, but it is ultimately a very personal thing, right? It comes down to where are you in life and how do you want to live and what do you want to do? And are you happy with the job? Do you want to do something different? Like, it becomes a very, very personal thing. And so I think for me personally, it was probably 4 or 5 years into the journey. I think I realized that this wasn't necessarily going to be my life's work, and I saw myself not doing this forever necessarily. Not because I didn't enjoy it, but just I think I just wanted to explore other things. I think I've always been interested in the wider world, and this business started for me almost as a happy accident. And so I think quite early on, I at least had the mindset of building something with a vision of being able to at least have the option to selling it. And so for me, it was about optionality in a way. It was about running the business in a way that it could be sold or options are on the table at the right time. And so I think the last few years of running the business, I always kind of had somewhere in the back of my mind that a sale might be something to look at some point if everything kind of fell into place.
Sure, and obviously you were running a digital agency, and the agency landscape at the moment. I mean, the year is 2024. We're halfway through the year, and it's been quite a tough landscape this year. I mean, what's your view on any listeners out there that are running an agency that are perhaps wondering, if they'll be able to sell at some point? What would be your thoughts to them?
Yeah, it's definitely been tough. I think anyone in the industry would say that probably so far this year it's probably been a buyer's market as such. I think valuations have naturally been suppressed. I think part of that's the macro environment and interest rates being harder, and basically just for any industry it being harder to finance a deal full stop in terms of any M&A activity. But also the added pressure then of AI and what kind of change is coming to the agency landscape. Beyond the macro pressures, like are we going through a bigger period of change in the agency world? So I think well-run, efficient, growing agencies will always have buyers out there. And you don't need to have a list of 100 interested buyers. You're only selling to one ultimately. So I think there's always opportunity out there for fundamentally well-run businesses. And to some extent, sometimes I get a bit philosophical about it and think, times like this are actually the test of solid businesses. Like, it's the businesses that get through these kind of periods that come out the other side that deserve to be acquired and have a good outcome. And not fun when you go through a bit of a flat period or a down period, but sometimes it's not fun for people that are kind of innocently caught in the chaos. But I think sometimes a bit of a clean up of an ecosystem and a clean out of businesses that are built on not solid foundations and aren't particularly well run isn't always a bad thing. I know that's easy to say, probably sat from where I'm sat with a bit more of a holistic view, but I think this is any business that makes it through this period and comes out the other side is a business worth investing in or acquiring, I think, as far as I'm concerned.
Sure. And when you sold your business, you were talking about obviously the buyer. Firstly, how did you find the buyer?
Yeah, so we had a couple of people approach us as interested buyers in kind of late 2020 or early 2021, and that caused me to think a bit more about what options were out there. And I think we'd had a really good kind of COVID period. We went into COVID as 15, 16 people and had basically doubled in size 18 months, 2 years later. And I'd always believed that the best time to sell an agency is when things are going really well and are on the up, and you can paint a really solid picture of kind of forward growth and all the things you're looking to achieve. You'll be able to negotiate a drastically different deal compared to if you're just kind of flatline and bumbling along. I'm sure we can talk a bit more about that. But so we had those couple of approaches, and then as I say, that triggered me to kind of kick off a bit more of a formal process. I was working with a board advisor at the time who was also kind of an M&A consultant, and alongside advisory work, kind of month to month, actively was working on selling agencies. So with him, kicked off a bit more of a formal process, and I guess we kind of went out to market at that point, not in a very large scale way. I think I was always anti the kind of go to a broker, what I call spray and pray approach, of kind of just email as many people as possible and see who might be out there. For us, it was a process of very, very research driven, looking at who was acquiring, who was in the industry, who was looking at similar types of businesses, who shared our kind of B2B niche a bit. And there's a lot of industry resources out there on fastest growing agencies and lots of news about agencies that have been acquiring, etc. So I think we put a short list together of maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20 agencies altogether, and basically began a process of through our M&A advisor, initially with a kind of anonymous information memorandum, going out and trying to make contact, and so that's how eventually we made contact with the buyer that we sold to.
And thank you, Alex. That was really useful to know, because I think a key thing that a lot of listeners will be thinking, and certainly from the clients that we've worked with over the years, they often wonder, how do these businesses find the right buyer? Because they don't just magic themselves out of thin air at the perfect time. Often there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, as you've described there, and obviously you've taken quite a considered approach. What was you were talking there about preparing, obviously like a sale memorandum to show to potential buyers. What was the most attractive thing from your buyer's perspective as to why they bought you? What was it that they really bought into when they saw your business amongst the others that they could have acquired?
Yeah. So I think our acquirer was they were actively on a kind of buy and build approach to growth. So that in itself meant they were kind of set up to do M&A and had done a couple before, and they kind of had the processes and people in place to do acquisitions, which from a seller's point of view makes things much more attractive, because you're selling to someone that knows what they're doing and isn't figuring this out for the first time. But I think any acquisition in the agency world is typically driven by synergies, and this whole kind of view of 1 + 1 has to equal 2.5 or 3, right? Agencies generally don't just want to buy more revenue or more profit. It doesn't really stack up that way. Sometimes maybe for larger private equity backed businesses, there's a bit of almost like EBITDA multiple arbitrage, where you can buy something at 5x, and because you're bolting onto a bigger platform, it's immediately the next day worth 8x or 10x, whatever it might be. But broadly, in I think most agency, even in that example, I think most agency acquisitions have to have more to it in terms of where are we going to unlock commercial synergies, cross-sell, upsell, client overlap. So I think we were very B2B tech focused. Our acquirer was also working a lot in the B2B and technology and kind of scale up startup space. So we had good overlap there, but they didn't offer the services that we offered. And so for them, it was a chance to move into a more integrated, fuller service business, which is what their whole M&A strategy was kind of driving towards. But at the same time, have a strong list of clients, and everything. Our clients range from Series A fintech through to Amazon was our biggest client, so a huge range of, I think, from the buyer's perspective, attractive clients that they could hopefully cross-sell, upsell, all kinds of other services that we didn't offer into, so comms and PR and all the things that our acquirer had. They were traditionally more of a PR and comms agency, we were a digital agency, so that's really where the synergies were. And I think most agency acquisitions are driven by, is there a service offering expansion or is there a geographic expansion in terms of entering a new market? Because that's ultimately how the deal's going to probably pay for itself, or at least pay for itself in a faster timeline.
Sure. And if you were talking to, an agency owner, obviously as you were an agency owner once upon a time, if you were talking to an agency owner that's running, a sensible sized agency, and when I say sensible size, obviously that's a really wide open thing to say, but I suppose that the key question is what are the key signs that you would look for in order to determine whether, you should think about selling this year, or no, actually you should think about doing this, and this before you should really think about selling, in order to get the best value that your agency deserves?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in a way, it's a bit like the first question you asked around it. I think the answer is that it's personal to some extent to the buyer, because some buyers are going to value more highly new service offerings. Some buyers are going to value more highly being able to enter a new geographic market. Some buyers are going to be more interested in the fact that you've got a perfect client that they've always wanted to work with. So there's this whole kind of matrix of a huge long list of things that matter. But I guess there's also some fundamental things which are maybe easier to talk about more generally. One of them is obviously just profit and profit margins, and making sure that's in a good place. I guess in the kind of small medium agency space, that kind of 20% net profit is often used as a bit of a rough line in the sand of an agency that's doing well from a profit angle. I think you generally want to be able to go out to market with good visibility of what the next year or so might look like. Obviously, project-based versus more retainer-based agencies can have different ways of doing that. I think there's often some, agencies with more retained revenue are often viewed as being more highly valued than those that are more project-based. And we actually went through quite an interesting transition ourselves of being more of a web design agency and having maybe 80% of our revenue was project-based, 20% retained, and we launched a set of new digital marketing services, and by the time we sold, we were over 50%, maybe 55, 60% was retained. And so we completely shifted that revenue profile, which was reflected in the deal we managed to achieve. Again, from a buyer's perspective, retained revenue is security. Ultimately, it's giving them comfort that the deal is funded and paying for itself. What else? So I guess profit. I mean, I think that the big thing that I always talk to agencies about is that kind of being on a trajectory more broadly, having a story and a narrative of this is where we are, this is what our kind of next 6 months, 12 months looks like, and this is all the things that we want to do. I've seen far too many agencies, and know many personally, that have spent years and years working towards some kind of sale and always come up with another excuse as to why it should be a year later or a year later. It's, we can get from 3 million revenue to 4, or they're kind of like the donkey with the carrot on the stick, and it's dangling in front of them, and it's always going to be dangling in front of them at the same distance, right? Because there's always something else. We can get profit from 15% to 20 and we'll be worth way more, or we can get headcount from here to here. There's always a reason to keep going. I think I had a much more balanced view of it, where I was kind of like ready to realize the value of things, and you can get a much better deal and negotiate on much stronger terms when you go into it as a seller from a position of strength. And I've talked about this recently on another podcast I did, but the worst possible outcome for me was that I just was going to go back to running the business. Right? I was able to go into the room with potential buyers and say, this is where we're at. It's all going really well. We won Amazon 3 months ago. Here's our numbers, and they're all going up and to the right. Like, how does this come together? Like, we want to continue the growth. We want to keep all the momentum that we've built over COVID. What can you offer us? And I was always shocked at initially those first meetings we had with potential buyers, at how much they were selling to us as much as we were trying to sell to them. and it's it's completely different if you spent 2 or 3 years relatively flat and your numbers aren't heading up and to the right, and you're trying to paint this picture of growth coming back and things. I think that's tough, and buyers can sense that, and buyers can smell sometimes desperation, but they can also see in the numbers that the business might not be as strong as you're trying to let on, and at that point, trying to negotiate is a struggle, I think.
Absolutely. And how about your team? Because at what stage did you communicate to your senior leadership team that you were thinking about selling? Because sometimes, the owners of the business won't communicate to anyone in the team until the deal is done. Others will communicate with just their senior leadership team members. So what was your approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think because of what I just mentioned, the fact that a sale wasn't necessarily going to happen, and unless it was going to happen on good terms, I wouldn't have gone ahead with it. I kept it relatively late, and it was probably in the last 4 to 6 weeks or so that I began to bring some of the senior leadership team into the picture on what was happening. Partly because the buyer wanted to meet some of them, which is quite natural, I think, in any agency acquisition where there's a senior leadership team in place. But I also, the reason for that was mainly not necessarily because it was a big secret, but just I didn't want it to be a distraction. I didn't want it to throw people off, especially if it didn't go ahead. Because if it didn't go ahead and then it had been in the pipeline, then everyone would be thinking, well, now what? And is there always going to be? I think I just felt like it was going to be easier and cleaner to just kind of leave it a little bit later. So yeah, by the time the deal was done, maybe 4, 5, 6 of the senior leadership team had known what was happening for the prior month or so and had lunch with the buyer and all of those kind of things. But the rest of the team all found out effectively when the deal was done.
Sure. And talking about the deal itself, so when you decided, actually, I like the buyer, I like the deal that's on the table, and the lawyers then need to get involved. At that point, just talk me through what your experience was like going through the legal aspect of a sale.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, looking back, kind of really enjoyed it. I've always kind of admired law as almost like an art form from a distance for a long time, and so I actually quite enjoyed being quite close to the process, and I purposely stayed quite close to it, even though we were working with an M&A advisor. I think we were somewhat fortunate that I remember lawyers saying at the time, once the buyer sends the first copy of the share purchase agreement, that will be the point at which we know whether we're in for an easy ride or a difficult one. And he said, within 5 minutes of getting that, I'll be able to tell you this is going to be straightforward or not. It's typically the buyer that drafts the share purchase agreement for the first time, I believe. So correct. It was kind of ball in their court. But I think we were lucky that, as I say, the buyer had done a few acquisitions before and had corporate finance people on their side, had lawyers on their side that I think they'd worked with before. And I think generally had instructed their lawyers to get things done pretty quickly. There was a bit of a rough line in the sand, I think, around some kind of financial year end coming up that was not time pressure, but it was a bit of a driver of speed to some extent. And yeah, I think they wanted it done and we wanted it done until we were able to go into it feeling like, it wasn't that someone was trying to make it complicated or chip away or cause, play fun and games. It was actually from the get-go a relatively straightforward, relatively balanced exercise. Obviously, there's a lot to it. Having specialists involved and having being able to tap into tax lawyers and employment lawyers and all the different people that added value was really helpful. But yeah, it was fascinating in terms of the mechanics. Lots to get my head around, but also a great learning opportunity too.
Yeah, I bet. And tell me about the due diligence process, because it sounds like you had it quite easy compared to some of the deals that we've seen over the years. So talk me through it.
Well, it was still, it was a lot of work. It was, I think it was it lasted probably only a few weeks, but it was kind of short but intense. And I think I was so kind of, once you've signed some kind of non-binding like letter or early stage agreement, and you've kind of got the rough outline of a deal in place, I think you're so fired up and ready to go, and there's a bit of adrenaline that you get the DD docs across and you're kind of raring to go. So I remember just kind of burning through it and having a few big late nights where I was working till the early hours, but just like chipping away at it. And I think the document ended up at like 170 odd pages by the time it was all done. So it wasn't short by any stretch, of just question after question of everything from like prove that you own your domain name, like log into the tool, take a screenshot. Like, so the granularity of it was what was striking. I think I found a lot of it quite out of date, and actually, this was driven by their lawyers. So, but actually, they fundamentally, I don't think, really understood kind of what we did some of the time, or at least the due diligence questions kind of implied that, questions around how we manage certain parts of our like software and stuff. And it's like, we don't have our own, we're not a tech company, we don't have our own product, we're delivering services using some of these products. So some quite basic things I think we were having to explain, but I guess I couldn't help but feel like the DD driven by the buyer's lawyers was a bit off the shelf and a little bit of a kind of just, here's a template, even if it doesn't quite fit you. But yeah, it was, I think I was fortunate that we were a well-run business and that everything was pretty organized. And I think even in the like 6 months, a year or so running up to the sale, I'd kind of loosely had a rough outline of a DD kind of data room in my Google Drive that I'd kind of gradually been chipping away at. If you have a Google, there's plenty of resources as to what a data room usually consists of. And I think it just felt kind of comforting to start getting organized and thinking about what was needed. So it was actually, yeah, as I say, kind of a shortish but intense process that I was definitely glad to get over. It went generally pretty smoothly. Towards the end, there was a final few things where actually I think we all just had to jump on a few calls and just me talking to their lawyer and just explaining things so she could kind of get her head around bits that were maybe just a bit too hard to put in emails or have kind of written back and forth on through. I think sometimes the Chinese whispers of, I tell my M&A person who tells a lawyer who tells their lawyer who goes back to the buyer, and by the time it's gone down 4 or 5 people, occasionally you just need to go, hang on, let's just all jump on a call and have a talk through this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's quite, you mentioned there about the due diligence questionnaire seeming a bit template driven and having certain questions on there that aren't particularly relevant. I think that's quite common. I think particularly for firms that haven't got a real detailed focus on the digital industry and understanding how that marketplace works. It's not to say that they won't do a good job, but you will notice things like that are just a bit clunky, but it sounds like you had a very well-oiled machine. And what I mean by that is, it sounds like to go through the due diligence process quite quickly, as you've described, you must have had good contracts in place with your clients. I mean, even the fact that you were talking about this particular due diligence process going into granular detail where you need a screenshot of proof that you own the domain name and the domain name interface that you log into to look at that, just screen grabbing that, tells me that it would have been a very thorough process. And you've obviously gone through that. So I take it you were very well organized with your policies, your contracts, and making sure that you had them in place. They were all signed, etc. Just give us a little bit more of an insight around that.
Broadly, yeah. I mean, I think there's always stuff that's going to come up. I think in any DD process that no matter how well run you are, there's always going to be bits. But there was definitely things where I was having to go back through kind of an email inbox and like try and dig out some statement of work from like 4 years earlier that hadn't been renewed, but we were still working with the client and try and work that out basically. And then I think some of them, it was just a case of full transparency. There's a couple of statements of work which actually need refreshing, and then it was up to the buyer and their lawyers to say, well, what to do next. But I think so I don't think we were 100 out of 100, but we might have been, 90 something % of the way there. And, random things around like insurances or getting information on our pension and how all of that worked. Sometimes you have to reach out to the pension provider and ask them for some kind of historical export, which kind of goes into some computer says no, 2-week process where some admin person has to send it to you like by post. And so there's all these quite like, you just end up getting stuck in a few kind of ruts of just arbitrary, old school, out of date processes. But yeah, fortunately, we didn't have anything major. I think contracts were in a good place, policies were in a good place. As I say, there was definitely some stuff that was a bit either hadn't been renewed or the contracts that needed updating or were using an old template. Or I think one thing to remember was that a few months prior to kicking things off, we'd gone through an exercise with our HR I think we had a consultant at the time to make sure all employment contracts were the same and up to date. Because I think a really common thing is that you've got someone that's been with you for 6 years and their employment contract's wildly different to the person that joined you 6 months ago. So just kind of leveling all of those and having the same template was important as well. So yeah, definitely some housekeeping, definitely some kind of slightly scatty, like, crap, where am I going to find that? And that's going to take a week or two. But nothing that was enough to really derail the process, fortunately.
Brilliant. And how did you manage your time and general stress management whilst going through that process, as well as trying to run your business at the same time? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that all of these things you've described are happening behind the scenes whilst you're doing your day job and trying to do the best there to keep the business running in a really good way. So talk us through that.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think, especially when you're kind of keeping a bit of a secret from the team, which isn't always the nicest feeling, but you can't really turn to people for support or be open with them. So it's quite easy for pressure to build and everything to get bottled up, I think. So I was trying to exercise a lot. Luckily, I had one of the great things about my M&A advisor, Andy, being our board advisor, was that I'd worked with him for 5 or 6 years. So I already had a really good relationship with him. It wasn't as if I'd appointed him 2 weeks earlier to sell the business. We were texting the whole time, talking the whole time. By the end of it, every time I opened my iPhone, Siri was suggesting I text Andy. It was like his face was popping up everywhere. I'd kind of taught this AI in my phone that Andy was like the most talked to contact. So we were joking at the time that I was speaking to him more than my girlfriend, my fiance now. So yeah, I think it's an intense process, and it can feel like it's on a bit of a knife edge at times. And to some extent, the closer you get to completion, the higher the pressure to some extent. You've done all this work and it's getting nearer, but there's always a slight fear that what if this happens or what if that happens? And just for context, the backdrop of a lot of my sale process was that we completed in April 22, but obviously a few months prior to that, everything in Russia and Ukraine had kicked off, and obviously awful. But these are, it sounds crazy, but these are the kind of world events that can have a shock to the system. All it takes is for someone to talk about a nuclear warhead or something, and actually just things seize up and stock markets drop and M&A pauses, even if it's temporarily. So I was always constantly anxious that there was something going to happen, or a bit nervous as it went on. But the flip side of that, though, is that I'd say I was really fortunate to have a strong leadership team, and that actually the last year or so running the business, I was pretty well removed from a lot of the day-to-day stuff. So obviously a lot of the standard leadership things and being close to that team and working with them regularly. But in terms of time inside the business, I was actually relatively well removed, and that kind of fell at a perfect time in our kind of growth trajectory, where I had a bit of free space from the business that I could concentrate on the M&A process. So overall, it wasn't too tricky, but I'd definitely say, you've got to rest, you've got to keep living outside of work, you've got to exercise, you've got to do all the things that you know are good for you, but become even more important when you're going through a stressful patch like that.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you had a good team around you. You were obviously talking about your M&A advisor there, Andy. What would you say to anyone that's going to be going through a sale at some point in the future are the really important advisors to have, in your wheelhouse around you?
Yeah, so I think obviously lawyers, I don't think anyone ever disputes the value of lawyers. They've got to be involved for a process like this, but having good lawyers that fundamentally understand, as you alluded to, the inside the industry and understand the mechanics of a business. Because I think, as you say, just because someone's not an expert doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do a bad job. But I think you'll have a much easier time when someone truly understands the space and understands the mechanics of client contracts and how you're servicing them, and just kind of broadly what you're doing, because the level of guidance and explanation and all the services you're getting can be customized to that. So there's a lot of value there. I think the one thing that does sometimes get disputed is, do you need an M&A advisor? Do you need someone like I had in Andy, who typically works on a percentage of the deal value structure to sell the business, usually ranging from a couple of percent to 4%, 5%, anywhere in that kind of range, I guess, for that kind of transaction, which sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money if you're selling something for 7 figures or more, but at the same time should, in my opinion, comfortably pay for itself. Even one simple clause helping to navigate the mechanics of an earn out or whatever it might be, can have a huge impact on, you know, the business and I guess the final outcome that you have from selling the business. So yeah, I'm always a bit surprised when I talk to other agencies and they go, do I really need to get an M&A advisor to help me, you know, sell the business for this much money? And they do the maths and like, God, that's going to be a 6-figure sum I'm paying that person. Can't I just do it myself? Or it's quite common when the seller knows the buyer. So it's quite common in agency land for people to sell to a bigger agency that they're already mates with, or they know the founders. And they think, do I really need to bring in this person to... I think I believe pretty passionately that contribution from an M&A person should pay for itself. Because I think the lawyers are always going to be have some input there and have some advice, but I think a lot of it's negotiation around what's best commercially. And I think having a good legal team and a good M&A person working in tandem on those things is definitely needed.
Agreed. Yeah, it's certainly helpful when you've got your team on the same page as well. And I know, you know, one of our corporate solicitors, she's always, you know, asking to be introduced as early as possible to the buyer's legal team and the advisory team, just so they can get to know each other, you know, to ensure that actually communication lines are established and, you know, it's nice and smooth, because of course we all want the deal to go through. There's a big perception that lawyers are there to try and disrupt the deal, slow it down and generate as much fee income as possible. And while that might be the case for some firms, it's certainly not the case for a number of others, including ours. You know, we want to get the deal complete quickly for you so you can go off and celebrate. But that's the interesting thing, because what quite a lot of founders don't fully appreciate until they go through the process is they're not necessarily going to get all the money off the table in one go. There's going to be strings attached, which we commonly call an earn-out. Deferred consideration is the legal term, but it's commonly known as the earn-out, where you'll get a certain percentage of the sale price, you know, up front, and then the other percentage will be based on perhaps some certain KPIs that are met over an agreed period of time. So talk me through, you know, whether you had to stay for an earn-out and how long that was, out of interest.
Yeah, I was really lucky that I actually ended up with I'm not sure I can go into tons of detail on it, but I've talked about this before in terms of basically having a non-contingent deferred consideration set up. So I kind of had a mini earn-out where we completed in April. We basically used our 31st of March financial year end accounts to kind of value the business. And so I had kind of almost like a mini earn-out for the end of that year as that financial year was approaching, but actually the earn-out was almost done before the deal was done. So it was just, there was a mechanism there for me to kind of keep driving towards the finish line of 31st of March, just because we were on a big growth spurt and we weren't sure exactly where we were going to go end up, and we had to go back to them a couple of times and say we're actually going to do more than we originally thought. So we were on a trajectory. So they basically said, here's a mini earn-out structure where, you know, anything above this amount gets a multiple of this and gets added onto things. So I was lucky in that sense. I think you're right that in the majority of agency deals there is a more traditional earn-out in terms of I think earn-outs can be structured in so many different ways. I think the best ones probably are more about rewarding upside than they are about punishing downside. But I think more traditional buyers can sometimes be, I've heard of all kinds of horror stories from all kinds of agency acquisitions. Sometimes they're done on profit, sometimes they're done on revenue, sometimes a combination. But I guess everything and anything can be thrown into an earn-out clause. But that's really where the magic, I think, of both M&A advisories that are deep inside these kind of things and have seen them all before from a corporate finance angle, and lawyers working together to say, don't sign that, or this is how it needs to be, is almost priceless, because all it takes is for, I've heard stories of agencies selling and basically, you're giving up control at that point, and then just as an earn-out's kind of coming to an end, someone, the new acquirer lets go a chunk of the team or moves things around or just changes something, and you can't hit your earn-out target. They're almost kind of like, they've given you an earn-out target which then they purposely kind of take to pieces, and you're powerless to do anything about it. It saves them some money. And so, hopefully these days, most buyers culturally are not that way inclined. And I think it's quite a short-sighted approach to treat an acquisition like that, because I don't think maybe it may seem beneficial short term, but longer term, probably not going to add any good stuff to the picture. So, it's I was, as I say, I was lucky that I didn't have that traditional earn-out structure, but I think that's where good advice is definitely able to add the most value overall.
Absolutely. And how about the deal timetable? Because that's another area where, we often find that clients want the deal to be complete within a certain time frame. That's either driven by the buyer or the seller, or both of them. They believe that it can be done within a certain time scale, and sometimes that time scale really isn't realistic. In other cases, obviously, it can be. So what, out of curiosity, was your deal timetable in terms of expectation versus reality?
Yeah, I don't think we were far off. I think we signed a letter of intent we were kind of working on it in December, but got it signed towards the end of Jan in the end. And we were all done by April the 22nd, I think. So actually, and I think the initial intention had been to get things done by the 31st of March. So relatively ambitious. But as I say, I think everybody thought there's nothing too complex here. We've done this before. This is a well-run small business. Everything's kind of in order. It shouldn't take as long as it needs to take. But I think with any deal, there's always things behind the scenes that you might not know about, particularly on the buyer side in terms of financing and doing some kind of counter, some seller's due diligence on the buyer as to how they're funding things and is the financing in place and all of those kind of things, because there's all kinds of things where certain buyers might be, I don't know, they might have a deal on the table but not yet have the financing, so they get the deal kind of ready to go, then they go and find the financing, and even though they say they've got the financing in place, they haven't actually, I've heard that a number of times. So there's all kinds of tricks where certain buyers might be trying to get things done in certain ways but might sometimes have the cart before the horse, or at least for phases of the deal. So important to look into those things, and again, I think good lawyers should be pushing their clients to ask the right questions about the buyer as well, which is hard to do, because I think once you've signed a letter of intent and you've got that energy and excitement, nobody wants to be looking for reasons to not do the deal, right? It's like, psychologically, why would you want to derail things at this point? And it's easy to kind of look the other way, or kind of turn a blind eye to things that might be a small red flag, but should actually have a bit more of a review.
It's we call it a Jerry Maguire moment, where when we look at the offer on the table for one of our clients, we will look at the number and we'll say to the client, show me the money, which is, what financial due diligence have you done on the buyer? How do you know that they can actually pay that sum that they've offered? Where's the money coming from? And probing around that and doing some due diligence around that. Because I think you've made a really good point there, which is the buyer's going to be doing some due diligence on you, but you should also be doing some due diligence on the buyer, and a big thing is the money and where that's coming from, how realistic that is. And we actually recently had a deal that stalled because the funds were coming from a particular part of the world where the clearances through the banking system took a lot longer from an anti-money laundering perspective. And that threw the deal off course for, I think it was about 2 weeks, give or take. It may have been a bit longer, but so these things can happen and are certainly worth looking at before putting pen to paper. So I think it's a good point that you've raised there.
I think it's also one of the valuable reasons to have a good M&A advisor in place, and lawyers as well. But having people around you that can have those sometimes slightly tougher conversations, kind of advisor to advisor, lawyer to lawyer, without you, because ultimately these are people that you might be working with for 2 or 3 years if you have an earn out, and you don't, founder to founder or founder to director of another agency, you don't really want to be having these slightly tough questions going like, where's the money? I think those conversations are best left to slightly independent third parties that do this for a living every day and are used to having tougher conversations. And that way you, as a founder who's going to be working for a new boss ultimately at some point, can kind of keep the relationship side of things running smoothly and without those challenging conversations, at least too early on. But I think doing good early, kind of counter due diligence is also a good test of, is this relationship going to work? Like, you should be able to have some degree of tough discussion. Better to find out early that you might not be the right cultural fit as you'd assumed, than to find out the day before you sign, or worse still, after you've signed.
And if you had your time again, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Good question. Honestly, I don't think there is a huge amount. I think I probably could have got a bit more organized on. I mean, I think I was already organized, but just in terms of data room and preparing things, I said you can Google things and find like due diligence checklists, but that's only going to show you so much. I think now, having been through it, I have a lot clearer sense of what we had to pull together. And if I ever was going to sell a business again, I think I'd do a few things. I'm a big believer in the like built to sell mentality, and even if you're not trying to sell the business, I think running the business as if you're going to sell it, a lot of good things fall into place and good practices are built into a business that's run that way. And so I think going through that process has just kind of confirmed all of that and amplified some of those things for me.
Brilliant. And this kind of leads to my final question, which is, and you've kind of already answered it, but for our listeners that might be thinking about selling their business one day, what key piece of advice would you give to them?
I think it is that. I think it's never too early to start getting ready. I think there's nothing worse than just kind of running a slightly scrappy, messy business, deciding you want to sell, and then in a panic over months paying expensive M&A people to try and help you solve it. It's just not necessary. You can run a nice, clean, well-run business. The analogy is always selling the house, right? Do you need to, do you kind of live in a horrible, messy house and then get builders in for a month before you sell it to clean everything and paint everything? Or do you just kind of look after your house as you go and keep it well maintained and have someone come in once a year for 2 days to do some tidying and do some painting? And I think that approach is much healthier, and will mean that you're in a much calmer, stronger position when it comes to selling. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Alex. Your insights, I'm sure, have been very useful to our listeners that have tuned in. That concludes our interview. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed listening. Please do feel free to subscribe and like this channel. You can find us on all of the key channels: Spotify, Apple Music, and also our website, hybridlegal.co.uk. You'll find a section with the Legal Loop where you can see all of our latest interviews. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you. Enjoyed talking.